G'day! Happy New Year, everyone. This month we're going back to Chaos. We're going to paint a Night Lord. Have a look at him. We've converted him up from the Blackstone Fortress dude. Yeah, we got a bit of an army of subsections going on here. Here we've got the power maul with some lightning coming off it, which is going to disappear. And here we've got the Mark 1 base that I made up, the original base, which I ended up changing my mind and redoing it. We're going to make a better base than this. And it's fun to change your mind throughout these projects. Let the model evolve the way it needs to evolve. So we've given it a quick prime with Chaos Black Spray, and as you can see here, some of the plastic is showing through, and that's fine, that's what we want. Anyway, before we can begin painting, we've got to consult the paint rack. Before we start any project, we've got to have a bit of a think about what we're doing first, not just going to jump into it straight off the bat with a blindfold. We want to just think about the colors and composition and all that kind of thing. Anyway, here's a good start. We've got a few paints going on here. What we've got here is a bit of Incubi Darkness and Drakenhof Nightshade. That's what we're thinking for the armor. Not something like this. We don't want that sort of, you go away, we don't want that. So we want something a bit more dark and moody, not so vibrant and saturated. So yeah, we're going to hit it up with Incubi Darkness and we're going to wash it with Drakenhof Nightshade. Obviously we're going to use some black. And I'm thinking of putting a bit of snow on the base, so we're going to get some white in there. I'm going to go two different golds. Balthazar Gold and Screaming Bell. Screaming Bell is basically a red, man. We're going to use this. We can use this for the wings. So most Night Lords have red wings, and normally you'd paint them something like this, Evil Sun Scarlet or whatever. But we're going to think outside the box, and we're going to use Screaming Bell, which is red. It's basically red. It's just metallic red. We are still going to use something like this for the eyes, though, and the plasma. We use Balthazar Gold for the trim. And I reckon we'll highlight it with something like this, Sarkorax Bronze, just to keep that gold nice and muted. We don't want it to be too saturated and drawing too much focus, really. We'll use something like this to create the lightning, Lothern Blue, and that's going to go nicely with this armor. Looks good together. And as I said before, we're going to get some red glow happening on the eyes and the plasma gun. We'll probably use Evil Sun Scarlet for that. And might get a bit of pink in there just to make it a little bit unnatural looking. Or maybe we can get some orange in there. Or maybe we'll just mash it all up together and see how that goes. We'll have to deal with some bone, so I reckon Rakarth Flesh is going to be the way to go there. It's a bit of a nice muted colour. It's going to go well with our Night Lord. Check this out. This is some red pigment that I've got that I want to try out. Look how intense it is. Compare that with something like this. It's just pretty hardcore, so we want to try that out. Here we go. That looks pretty good, as the saying goes. That's pretty much what I do. I just grab a whole bunch of paints like that and I go, yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's paint it. So without further ado, let's get to chapter 2, blocking in. We're going to get Abaddon Black for this. And we've already sprayed this with Chaos Black, so we just want to do a nice thin coat of this. That paint, get that nice and wet, watered down consistency, and just start hooking into it, painting over the model, filling up all of the gaps. As I mentioned before, this has been primed with Chaos Black spray, and when I prime, I like to do a nice light prime so that the paint's kind of speckly. The whole point of a prime is not to apply your first color. It's to prime it, mate. It's to get a bit of a speckled finish, so the paint has something to stick to. So all we're doing now is just filling up those gaps that we've missed and just pulling it all together. We're going to get out the Incubi Darkness, and this is our first real color. We're going to thin it down on the wet palette there. You can see I just grab a few beads of water and just mix it in. That's how I'm going to be mixing my paints from now on. So there's nothing to it. We're just going to start painting all of the armor with Incubi Darkness. You can see that it's been thinned right down with water. It's very important at this stage. We're going to be putting lots of layers, lots of different colors over this. So right from the get-go, we want to make sure that paint's nice and thin. We're not clogging up detail. We're not going to leave brush strokes or little crummies or anything like that. We are, however, going to need to do 2 coats of this. You could do 3 if you want, but I'm not too worried. Like I said, we're going to be putting a lot of colors over this, so if you can see a little bit of transparent paint through here and there, I'm not worried. I'm really never worried with that sort of thing with my models because, you know, like I just said, I just keep putting more and more paint over it, and by the end, you're not going to see it if there's a tiny little bit of black showing through this color here. But we definitely want to do at least 2 coats. So we'll just make our way around the model here, and don't even waste your time being neat. Bugger it, just get into it and get it done quick so we can move on to the fun stuff. I'm really a block it in type operator. I like to get it all done at the start, all this boring stuff, so that we can just move on to the fun stuff. Have a look, that's after the first coat. You can see it really does need a second coat. So let's just get into it, get it done. This Incubi Darkness is quite green. It's got a bit of a green sort of tinge to it, which we don't really want. We're going to change those color properties later though, so don't worry about that for now. Let's start painting some of the pipes with Rakarth flesh. We definitely don't want to paint all of the pipes with Rakarth flesh. In fact, we want the minority of them to be Rakarth flesh. We're actually going to paint most of these pipes black, but we just want a few of them just to pop out a little bit and be a little bit more interesting. We're going to paint these kind of like a feral skin color type stuff. We're going to get some nasty ass veins going through it. Like these pipes have kind of come alive or something. I don't know. Just kind of chaosy, I guess. And got that kind of mutation thing going on. Just mixes it up as well. Yeah, so this one here, I started to paint skin color, but decided against it. We're going to repaint that black because we're going to have some lightning coming out of these cracks, and I want that to reflect off the black pipes, and it's not going to work so well reflecting off a skin color pipe. So we'll keep that in mind, that pipes that are coming out of cracks, we want those to be black because the lightning on this fella is going to be coming out of the cracks. It's going to originate from those cracks. Anyway, we'll get into that a little bit later. For now, we've got to crack out the Balthazar gold and begin blocking in all of the trim. This is a really awesome color, really. It's got really good coverage. It's good just for any kind of gold. Even if you don't know what sort of gold you want to do, you can base coat it with this color, and you can quite easily change the properties of this color. I find that this color can turn into anything. You just base it, just whack it down, and then depending on what golds you use to highlight over it, that is what will determine the color of the gold. Even the colors that we use to shade it or glaze it, that can change the color of this completely. And you'll see that's exactly what we do later on. And as I mentioned earlier, for this Night Lord, we're going to use 2 different golds. So we need to be careful with that. And the plan there is to make this nice and muted and not stand out too much. And in contrast, the other gold, which will be the red gold used on his wings, we're going to make that quite prominent because that's going to be a feature of the model, and it's going to help draw your attention to the head. And if you can draw the attention to the head of a model, then you're doing something right. Lead belcher. We're just going to use this to paint all of the pipes, the internal pipes that we can see in the tears. And this pipe here is completely exposed. We're going to paint that. And we'll make our way around the whole model, all the subsections. Just picking out these little pipes, these little exposed pipes, as well as anything else that might be silver, like those gas canisters on his face. These little pipes at the back of his ankle. And there's a few little cheeky ones in here. We don't want to miss those. There's a few little silver details in there around the ear as well. And of course, these little exhaust things, these exhaust pipes. They're always silver in my book. And what Chaos Space Marine doesn't have a few silver spikes poking out of his armor? Here we've got the metal areas of the gun. We're going to paint the panels on the front of the gun. We're going to paint those black later on, but make sure we paint in between them with a bit of this lead belcher. And the handle there, we'll get that silver too. And of course, his power maul. We've painted the fancy bits, Balthazar gold. We just want to paint the internal bits, the stuff that does the banging. We're going to make that kind of a steel color. And you'll see later on those clunky bits of lightning, I just remove them. I'm just like, bro, I'm not feeling that anymore. Let's chop it. And that's the way it goes. You should always allow yourself to change the model for the better if you need to. Let the model evolve. Don't just be a stubborn bugger. Just let it do what it needs to do. Rhinox hide, let's use it. Let's use and abuse it. We're just going to paint the leather belt going around his waist and this little pouch. Probably got gold coins in there. And we're going to paint the strapping on his power maul. Ripper of a color. Rhinox hide. Very versatile. I use it a lot. We're going to go for a bit of a dull greyish kind of color here. Going back to Rakarth flesh for the back of their head here, which I forgot to paint earlier. This is a bit of exposed skin because of the conversion. Using the Knight of Shrouds, the Nighthaunt fella, using his helmet, which is more of a mask than a helmet. So we can see a bit of the back of his head. Now we're going to clean up the pipes. The black pipes, the pipes we want to be black, with, believe it or not, we're going to use Abaddon black for that. And they're already painted really, but when we're getting into it with Incubite Darkness and Balthazar Gold and all that, we just get it. We're just making a bit of a mess. So all we've got to do is just clean it up. It shouldn't take long. But we do need a nice solid, really nice solid black to make these pipes look good. And we'll have to go around the little tears there, clean it up from the lead belcher that no doubt spilled out all over the place. We probably just got that all over the shop. Not to worry. Check it out. Here's a sneaky joint in the armor, hiding in this little tear in the cloak. We need to pick out those, as well as his eye sockets. Let's make those nice and dark. More pipes. There are so many bloody pipes on this fella, but as much as a pain in the arse it was to paint, I love them. I reckon they just look so good. To me, this is what Chaos is all about, isn't it? They once had Imperial armor, and over the years of being heretics and naughty and all that, modding it, putting bits on that the Emperor wouldn't approve of, like pipes and spiky bits. That's what a Chaos fella would do, and that's what I love to see in these new models that G-Dub's doing. They're actually putting this kind of detail in it and giving them the attention they deserve, and it's just really cool, man. I'm loving it. Anyway, Screaming Bell. Here's the first layer of the reddish gold that we're going to use for the wings. Let's whack a bit down here on some of these random pipes, and that's just gonna help make those copper wings relate to the rest of the model, because those copper wings, they're quite out there. They're going to be a bit of a feature, so we don't want them to be too random. We want to tie it to the rest of the model, and we can do that just by having a few little flashes of it here and there. Some of these little baby pipes. Now we're just going to do a real quick touch up before we move on to highlighting and shading the rest of the model and making him start looking a bit interesting. I always say that when you're doing the blocking in stage, to not be too neat with it, because you just waste your time. And you don't want to be going all dopey with it and just slapping it over the place like a drunk person. But, just get it done quick, and then we can always go back and touch it up at this stage. And I find that much quicker. I find it easier psychologically as well. Knowing that I'm getting through this stage quick. I'm not taking too long. Here we got a couple of sneaky horns or spikes or teeth that I didn't see before. There's two on the shoulder pad here. And then there's one on the tip of the gun. We're just going to paint those with Rakarth flesh, as with the rest of the bone, like the skull we painted earlier. And here he is, ready to go. Part 3, the armor. Yeah, well, this stage is going to be either your best mate or your worst enemy. It's a bit of a long slog, but it's very important to get this right. The armor makes up, what do you reckon, about 80% of the model? So yeah, it's a big deal, and we've got to get it right. We're using Skaven Blight Dinge. And we're using this to just paint, or sketch if you will, where we want basically the highlights to be. And we're not blending this right now. We're just painting it roughly like here along this arm. We're going to have a bit of a shine. So from this panel to the next panel, we're just going to paint sort of a rough line, reasonably thick as well. Thick as in wide, not thick, like we don't want the paint thick, of course. This paint is thinned down, but it's not, we don't want it to be too transparent. We want a fairly opaque layer. On the tips of the toes here, We're creating a bit of a shine. We're going to create a bit of a shine, and this Skaven Blight Dinge is the first step in that process. So we're painting a reasonably large area, and then later on we're going to go over that area, within that area, with a brighter color, and work our way up the highlights. The highlight ladder, maybe. This is not a neat stage. This is one of those stages where you just want to get it done quick, sort of like the blocking in. As we progress from one stage to the next, we want to progressively get a little bit neater and a little bit neater as we begin refining the armor. But yes, this stage is just slap it on roughly where you think the light's going to be. And don't worry if we don't get it quite right. I get a little bit of it wrong here too. And in the following stages, we can tweak it and correct it as needed. You don't expect yourself to just get this correct the very first time. Placing light on these kinds of things is a bit difficult. You just have to do your best and just apply it where you think it's going to look the best. You don't need to be a scientist of light. I'm certainly not a scientist. I just put the light roughly where I think it's going to translate the best and look the best. On the shoulder pads here, I'll just paint pretty much the top half of it with this Skaven Blight Dinge, or whatever the first layer of this process might be, in a bit of a circular motion. It's like a semicircle. And along the arms, I like to create a bit of a shine, going from one panel to the next. It translates well and makes that armor look like it's slightly shiny, or it's reflecting some kind of light. Now we'll switch to Dawnstone, and we'll begin refining that light by painting more shines within that Skaven Blight Dinge. Here's a bit of a visual description of what I'm talking about. So we're basing it with Incubi Darkness. Then we're going to lay out our rough highlights using Skaven Blight Dinge. And it's completely opaque, it's not transparent. Within that area, we're going to highlight with Dawnstone, which is what we're doing right now. Then we're going to begin blending those two grey areas back down using thinned down Skaven Blight Dinge. Then we're going to do the same thing using Incubi Darkness to blend the Incubi Darkness and Skaven Blight Dinge colours. Then we can begin adding highlights, edge highlights. And that's the basic idea of what we're doing right now. After that, we're going to be doing some glazing and changing the color properties a little bit, introducing a little bit of blue. But for now, that's the basic concept. So we're doing those opaque colors kind of loosely and sketchy, and then we're going to blend them back down using the previous colors. And that's going to create a nice smooth blend and some cool transitions. We're going to get some blue to gray transitions, which is going to look quite unique. The color of this armor is really important. Like I said before, it makes up most of the model, so getting that color right is very important. And back when we were talking about colors, back in step 1, when we were consulting the paint rack, we for this model, we don't want to have a very bright saturated blue for the armor. We want to be a little bit different and use an unsaturated color. So that's why we're using gray to highlight here. We're going for a mood here. We want this guy to look scary and evil and dark. And on top of that, he's a Night Lord. So I thought it would be cool to make him look like he's actually walking around at night time. So we definitely don't want bright blue for the armor. I've always loved Night Lords, and I've been painting Warhammer for about 20 years now. Well, I mean, like there's about 10 years of that. Maybe I was doing other stuff, I guess. But ever since I started, I've loved Night Lords. But in that 20 years time, this is the only Night Lord I've ever painted. I'd actually really love to paint one of each of the chapters for you guys. Like, I'd love to paint an Emperor's Children fella and an Alpha Legion dude. How about that new jetpack guy, Harkin? I'd turn him into a corn bloke for sure. The way he's leaping and charging like that. Next stage, we're using Skaven Blight Dinge to blend these areas together now. So we've thinned it right down into a very thin glaze, and just wipe it on the tissue and absorb some of that water so it's not going to flood out all over the shop. Then we can begin just blurring that line between the Skaven Blight Dinge and the Dawnstone. We just sort of paint over it and blend it together, blend it into the blue a little bit into the Dawnstone. And you'll see it's quite easy. It quite easily and quickly starts looking like a bit of a decent blend. At this point, we can also begin fixing up some of the dodginess from before. I mean, if we put some highlights in the wrong place, like on his right knee, I think I put a bit too much of a line going down the center of the shin. So at this stage, I'll start sort of cutting that out and keeping a bit more of a highlight towards the top of the knee rather than going straight down the center of the shin, which was looking a bit weird. You can see a little bit of a line down there. It's a little bit on his left leg too. I was going a bit strong with the line down the shin plate. So using a bit of that Skaven Blight Dinge just to cut out some of the Dawnstone and pull it back. And later on, when we get into the Incubi Darkness, we'll do that even more. With the chest plate, I usually try to keep the top of the chest plate nice and bright, and the bottom of it will fade to the darker color. So when we're looking at that model, we're going to naturally follow the highlights, and our eye is going to go up the breastplate and look up as it gets lighter and lighter, and then before we know it, we're looking at his face. So it's quite easy to do this stage, and it's a bit of a relaxing stage because it's just so easy, and it's quite rewarding because you're just making easy blends. This is just the easiest way to blend. Laying out those solid colors and then just blurring the lines. That's what we're doing. I mentioned before that I'd never painted a Night Lord before. So how do I know what I'm doing right now? Well, sometimes I just wing it, and other times I do a little test. And so what we're doing right here is we're using Incubi Darkness, which is a very dark blue with a bit of green in it, and we're highlighting it with grays. What's going on, man? Like, that almost doesn't make sense. But I had the idea in my head before we started. This is what I wanted to do. So I tested it out just to make sure it worked, because I don't want to be filming a video for you guys and not know what I'm doing. So you can do the same thing. If you need to come up with a color scheme for your army, grab a pair of old Space Marine legs that you're never going to paint, or just some piece, some component that you've got lying around that you don't need anymore. For me, for this guy, I used a set of old Terminator legs, and I'm never going to paint them, man. Like, I don't care. So away I went. I painted one leg in this exact method, and I painted the other leg in a slightly different method that involved a bit of Rhinox hide. And I took both of those legs to completion, and then I could compare them when they were finished, and it's chalk and cheese. One leg looked bloody awesome, and the other leg looked just a little bit wrong. So I went with the bloody awesome one, didn't I? And it's a pretty avant-garde type process what we're doing here. It's a little bit different, using that kind of blue on a Night Lord for starters, and then highlighting it up with grey. But you'll see once we've highlighted it with grey, we're going to pull it all together with a dark blue wash. And it's just going to change everything. It's going to change the whole look of the model. And I like doing that. I like doing that with my models. I do it with my Plague Marines. They start off looking a bit like, what's going on here? And then as soon as I do a few washes and a few glazes, changing the colors, it starts looking very interesting. Because we've used those unexpected colors as the foundation layers, and those will always shine through the glazes that we do. So keep that in mind. I'd say when you want to come up with your schemes, just paint a small piece and just test out your theories, test out your ideas, just so you don't go and paint a whole model and realize that it's not going to work. So we're still making our way around this bad boy. We're dinging it up with Skaven Blight Dinge. Blurring those lines together, getting the foundations of those blends. Setting us up for some cool armor. I've made this section of the video a little bit longer than I'd normally like to, but I wanted to do that to show you a little bit more detail of this blending, where I'm putting the highlights and how I'm blending it all together. You can get a bit more of an insight into this process, because as I keep saying, it's the armor and it's a really important stage. It's time for the Incubi Darkness blend. Now we can really fix up any kind of highlights that we're not digging, like this knee pad here, this shin plate, sorry. You can see I'm blending some of that Incubi Darkness into it, especially in the bottom half of it. And when you blend like this, you should always direct the paint to where you want it to be thickest, or strongest, sorry. What do I mean by that? Well, wherever your brush leaves the model, it will inevitably leave a small puddle of the paint, and that's where the paint is going to be strongest, always, every time. So where you want the paint to be thinner, that's where your paintbrush should touch the model first. And where you want the paint to be strongest, that's where the paintbrush should leave the model. While we're doing this stage with the Incubi Darkness, we're actually making that grey a little bit more coloured as well. So when we're glazing over that grey, some of the incubite darkness, the blue and the green from it, is starting to stain the grey, the Skaven Blight Dinge and the Dawnstone, which is helping to blend the colours together as well as add a little bit more blue. You can see here we're pushing the paint towards that crease where we want it to be strongest and darkest, and we want it to be lighter on the tip of the foot. Again, with the breastplate, we're directing that paint downwards because we want it to be darker towards the bottom and lighter at the top. You should do this as much as you can wherever possible. For the front of the forehead, we want it to be darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. Because for that panel, the top of the head should be lighter. And on the temple, we're going to reverse it so that we get a bit of a reverse gradient thing happening. So we're going to make it lighter at the bottom where the cheek flares out and catches more light, and it will be darker towards the top of the temple where it dips inwards. It also matches up nicely to the lightness on the top of the head, that temple being dark at the top and the head being light, so we get a nice contrast, a bit of reverse gradient, if you will. And of course, we really want to push that and enhance that later on when we get into the highlights. With the hand and the arm, we want to keep that incubite darkness away from those shines that run down the center of the arm. So we'll just focus this towards the middle of the sections. Check out my thumb there. I'm always controlling my paint on the thumb. So once you stick your paintbrush in a bunch of paint that's just sitting there floating on your wet palette, you don't really have much idea of what's on there. So, well, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, but you can always just give it a quick flick on the thumb just to gauge what's going on with the brush, how much paint's on it. If you need to adjust, you can. Sometimes the paint's too thin, or sometimes your brush might be you've just like sucked up way too much paint on that brush, and then as soon as it hits the model, it just floods out everywhere. You can make a bit of a mess. So just be aware of that. Sometimes you need your thumb or your hand or whatever, just so you can gauge it. If you don't want to paint it on your thumb, you can have a piece of paper, a bit of wax paper or something sitting there ready to go. Give the paintbrush a bit of a wipe or a twist. Just blending, just making it all smooth. Away we go around the model. It does take a long time to do this, and I want to show it to you. I want to show you this is the majority of the model being done here. Thanks everybody for voting for the next model that I'm going to paint for you. I'm thinking that I'm going to leave the Gene Stealer cults for about a month or so until G-Dub brings out the new models, because I reckon they're going to bring out some pretty cool stuff, and I really like the dirt bikes. So depending on what other cool stuff they might bring out for the Gene Stealer Colts when the Codex finally arrives, I might paint a Gene Stealer dirt bike for you dudes. What do you reckon? That does mean that the winner for the next one is Drukhari. I got some ideas for that. So stay tuned. Of course, it's going to be something different. That's my style. I like to try and do things that we haven't seen before. I'm always trying to think outside the box, and that's what I want to try and show you guys how to do. Just got to come up with ideas that just knock socks off and blow minds and make dudes go far out. That's just sick. And a really simple way to do that is what we've already talked about in this video, and we sort of touched on it in the White Scar video. Just choosing colors that are a little bit different. Instead of choosing a red, choose a metallic red, choose a copper. Or instead of choosing red, choose a brown. Choose a brown that's got red in it. And right now, we're painting a Night Lord, right? And pretty much every Night Lord that you'd see on the internet is a bright, saturated blue color with sort of 80s style airbrushed lightning painted on the armor. And that's cool. That's what they are. That's what a Night Lord is. But when I see that, I try to interpret it a bit differently, while still keeping some of that iconography in the classic Night Lord stuff. Like we still want this armor to be blue, and we still want there to be lightning on it. But we are going to make that blue dark and scary. We're not going to make it bright like, my eyes. In the lightning, we're going to do something a little bit different for the lightning as well. We're not going to have that airbrushed look all over the armor. We're going to try and make the lightning, we're going to interpret that lightning as kind of like sparks originating from within the armor. So all these pipes and everything, he's got some electrics going on inside. So he's going to have sparks going off. He's short circuiting, and all that electric activity is going to be shining through the cracks and translating through onto the armor as lightning. Here we go. A bit of administratum grey. Now we're just using this to push the highlights, get this stuff close to the edges and water it down, obviously, get it nice and thin into a bit of a glaze, and we're just going to blend it and push this towards the edges where we want it to be strongest. So we kind of start a couple of mils out from the edge and just push it towards the edge, and you get an instant gradient. And this is laying down a foundation for the glaze that we're going to do very shortly. When the glaze hits this light color, that's going to go nice and blue. It's not going to be too saturated, but it's definitely going to pick up a lot of the blue and shine through that blue. So again, we just work our way around this fella, picking out all of those highlights, all of the highlights that we've been working on for the past few hours. Just making the armor look as good as we can make it. And as we've progressed through the colors and the different stages of the armor, we've been getting a little bit neater and neater. So you want to be quite neat at this stage. get your finesse on. And I'm using my Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush for this. Getting fancy with it. I sort of used the Games Workshop brushes for all of the industrial stuff, all the heavy lifting, and I just sort of use and abuse them. I just get the tough work done with it, and then I save the nice, clean finesse work for my good brushes, so I don't wreck them basically. All of these gradients that we've put into his head, on the top of his head and his cheeks, just enhance those. We can also begin highlighting around the cracks and working our way into that sort of area. There are a lot of cracks on this model, and we're going to make them sparking and surging power. So we need the outsides of those cracks to be highlighted. So we just a couple of mils out from each crack and just push that administratum grey towards the edge where we want it to be brightest. Highlight under the cheeks here and under the nasal cavity as well. And the tops of the pauldrons, of course, we want those to be nice and bright. The shoulder pauldrons are really good for helping you to direct attention towards the center of the head. Generally, they sit either side of the head, so if you can make the shoulder pads or the shoulder pauldrons nice and bright, you can help direct the viewer to the face. And we're getting there. We're almost done with this stage of the armor. And then we can move on to something a little bit different, which is glazing. Make sure we highlight the tops of the edges of the feet, as well as the bottom. I'm a fiend for highlighting the bottom of the feet. I don't know why. A lot of the times you can't even see it, but just occasionally you can. And it doesn't hurt to give it a quick highlight. Sometimes if you can see the bottom of the feet and if it's been highlighted, it adds a little bit of finesse to the model. Like it just separates that foot from the environment a little bit. Gives a bit of contrast. You can see here the shine that I'm talking about going down the center of this limb. When we highlight the metal, we'll continue that shine, as well as when we highlight the joint in the armor. The black rubbery undersuit or whatever it is will continue that shine through all of the elements. And because these paints are so thinned down, we can go over them again and again, making them stronger where we need them to be, and just gradually refining it with each brush stroke. And it's very important as well to paint the fingers and show a lot of attention to them. Make sure we get the knuckles and the tips of the fingers, as well as each little panel within the finger. These subsections, the two arms, I've taken them off their wire. And I've done that so that I can place them onto the main body and just have them sitting there every now and then so that I can check the light and make sure everything's looking okay. As well as that, his right arm, this shoulder pauldron is split in two, so it helps to have them butt up every now and then and just sitting next to each other so that we can make sure that the highlights are consistent. And you know, like one side isn't really bright and the other one's hasn't even had any highlighting done to it. So it means we've got to handle it a little bit. And the problem with handling these is that some of these highlights will rub off. But it's okay because right at the end, we just touch it all up when the model's all glued together, and we just do a once over and we can go, oh yeah, look at his fingers, mate. There's just, the highlights have rubbed off there. We'll just whack a bit of extra highlight on there and she'll be right. Yeah, don't forget to highlight around these cracks in the armor. It just makes it a little bit easier later on when we start defining where the electricity is going to be coming from. And these parts, these spheres on the backpack, we want to try and get a bit of a zenithal highlight happening with those. So we want a round, like a circular highlight on the tops of each of these domes. With the backpack, there are also these few little sneaky bits of blue armor hiding amongst all of the cables and the pipes. So we can't forget to do those. Now we need to just do a quick tidy up with Rakarth flesh over all of the fleshy skin coloured pipes that we're going to do. As well as this little skull going on here. We just want to clean it up. We've been painting this armor for quite a while now and there's definitely some damage. And we need it nice and clean for this stage, which is Drakenhof Nightshade. And we're going to paint this over the entire model, except for the black cloak. Just avoid putting it on that black, we don't need it on there. But everywhere else, that includes all of the blue armor, all of the bronze trim, the copper red wings, all of the bone, and all of the skin-coloured pipes everywhere. And this is key. We're using a blue wash, a very dark blue wash, and we're tying all of these colours together. We're giving them all something in common with each other, which is blue, a midnight blue, if you will, because we're trying to give this Night Lord a bit of a mood, like he's dark and gloomy, and he's possibly walking around at nighttime. So when you're walking around at nighttime, you start looking a bit blue. Everything starts kind of reflecting the dark blue sky or the moon. So every single element of this model is going to have blue in it. That includes the cape. We're gonna add blue to that later. We don't want to add any Drakenhof Nightshade to it though, but we're going to highlight it with some blues later on. So this fella is going to look cold and dark, like he's walking around at nighttime. There's going to be a bit of a winter thing happening. He's going to look cold and he's just going to be ominous and gloomy. Night Lords seem to have a bit of an undead vibe happening with them, maybe a vampire type thing going on. So I think the night theme and the cold snowy look that we're going to go for, I think that's all going to work well. Now we are washing this model with Drakenhof Nightshade, but we certainly don't want to flood it Don't let this go out of control and don't put too much. The main goal is to tint everything with a bit of blue. We definitely do want it to sit in the gaps and define the different elements. Of course we do, but we don't want it ruining all of the nice blending that we've done, all of the work. And here's what it looks like when it's dried. It immediately just looks so cool. Like everything. Look at the color of the bronze armor. It's just totally changed the color of that Balthazar gold. And this backpack here with all of the pipes. Have a go at the lightning on this mace. It's already broken off. Who cares? We're going to chop it later. Even that brown strapping has turned out really cool with the Drakenhof wash. Sorry to say, but we've got to get back to the armor for a little while. We're using Thunderhawk blue here, and we're just glazing it towards the highlights in a similar way as the Administratum grey that we did a little earlier. In a very similar way. We're just adding a little bit of blue, and look at the chest here. What we've done so far, you can see it immediately looks like he's walking around at night time. Thunderhawk blue is a very muted blue. It's a good midpoint between grey and blue, which is what we're after, keeping away from the really saturated stuff for the armor at least. Contrast, man. We want some dull, dark armor, and that's going to contrast well with some really bright, intense electricity and plasma. So this is a reasonably quick stage, but we want to focus on tinting the highlights, as well as we can use this to clean up any sort of dodginess that occurred from hitting it with a wash, because a wash can be a pretty rough stage for a model. It takes a beating, mate. Like, it cops it when you do a wash. Like, we've spent hours on this fella putting the nice blending into it, and then we went and did a wash over it. So we just have to repair it a little bit here and there. Making that nice and thin. Really, really thin paint. So remember the consistency of this kind of operation. We want it very, very watery. It's more water than it is paint. Probably 70% water, 30% paint, or thereabouts. I'm not really a mathematician. At this point, let's add some scratches. So to add really thin scratches, what you got to do is firstly, you've got to have a good brush. You've got to have a good brush with a fine point. Secondly, that paint has to be very thin with water. And of course, once that brush is loaded up with water, it's got to be wiped on a paper towel or something, so that it's not going to flood out all over the place, because that won't make a sharp scratch. So we can just begin adding random scratches, make some of them crisscross. It looks good if you sort of originate these scratches from the edges like this. Makes the edge look kind of raggedy. Mix it up a little bit more. Thunderhawk blue there. Got really, really hot days here in Sydney at the moment. My paint's drying pretty quick. So if you've got a similar climate and it's like 42 degrees and it's off the tree hot, then what you've got to do is just make your paints a lot thinner than you normally would. and keep that paint on your brush, keep it nice and wet. Painting that sort of climate has sort of taught me to paint like that with really wet paints. Almost every single color that touches my models has been really thinned down with water. Yeah, so don't forget to give a lot of attention to the fingers and the knuckles and the fingertips and all of the different joints in the finger armor. Show them a lot of love, because it does go a long way when the fingers look good. The fingers are the things that are holding the weapons, and we're often looking at the weapons going, oh wow, that's cool. That's a cool plasma gun or a power sword or a bloody huge axe, whatever. The fingers are the things that are holding those weapons. The hands or the gloves, that's what's holding the big bloody gauntlets. So yeah, just show a lot of attention to the fingers. Paint them good. Now let's move on to Ulthuan Grey. We'll be using this to accentuate the highlights and just push them a little bit further, and then we're all done. This is the last color for the armor. So we need this to just pop it on the corners of things, on the tops of the edges, the little sharp bits, whatever, making this armor look really, really good. We'll use this to highlight a few of the scratches as well. So this point right there where there's two scratches crossing each other, just whacked a little dot of Ulthuan Grey where those two scratches intersect. Here, where these scratches originate from the edge of the armor, just painting a little dot near them just to pop them out, to make them look like they've actually scratched into the armor and there's a bit of depth going on. Of course, we want to get the top of this breastplate. This is the very last highlight that we get to put on this armor, so we're going to make it good. This is our neatest painting. And we'll get those cracks where the pipes are coming out. We'll get those nice and sharp. And the cheekbone or the eye socket, we're going to get some cool glow happening on there later on. So if we can get a nice highlight there, we can set it up, lay the foundations for it. And when we're using this Ulthuan Grey to do the final highlight, we can do a little bit of a stipple here and there, and that helps to create a bit of irregularity on the armor, on the surface of the armor. So maybe it's a little bit bumpy or it's a little bit battle damaged. If we stipple the edges rather than just doing an edge highlight like a line, then the armor can look like it's a bit wonky and battle damaged. And like with all of the other colors that we've used so far, we're making this nice and thin so we can layer it up if we need to. We're not just going 100% color, bang. Because if we've done too much, well, what do you do then? You're going to fix it. So we're laying transparent paint down, 50% color, 40%, 30%, whatever you want. Just not 100% color. Because if you need it to be 100% color, just layer it up and make it more and more bright. You can always add more paint, but it's a lot harder to take it away. Look at this. What I'm talking about, gauntlets. I don't know what it is with my fingers, but I've got to make fingers look as good as I can make them. Got finger fetish, I guess. It doesn't sound good. I don't know. I guess I just like my gloves looking their best. Leave me alone. It's the coolest backpack, eh? Like, look at all those pipes and the detail on it. Chaos Space Marines, they've got to have this kind of detail. They've got to be really separated from the Imperial Space Marines. Like, they've just been modifying this over years and years and years. They've bastardized it with all sorts of crap from across the galaxies and whatever. I don't know. Traded parts for it. I don't know. I just think it looks cool. Yeah, it just makes it really fun to paint. We're almost finished with this armor, I promise. Just bear with me. We'll get to some more fun stuff soon. Just gotta lay down the last of these highlights. Make that armor look schmick. Spick and span. Highlighting a little scratch there on the corner of the armor. Little details like that go a long way. Just a little scratch crossing that border. The divide between the elbow pad. Put a bit too much paint on there. Quickly whack out your G-dub brush and sort of feather it out before it dries. Then you get a nice little blend. You can see how the contrast of the highlighting just really makes these armor panels come to life when you give them the attention that they deserve. We're using Ulthuan Grey here on highlighting the edges. We're using Ulthuan Grey because it is a grey, and it's a white, and it's a blue. It's all the things that we need to do. Adding more scratches. It's really fun adding scratches. Just don't go overboard with it. You can go overboard with adding detail like that. More fingers. Fingers that you possibly won't even see. I'm pretty sure it's very hard to see these fingers. So you probably don't need to be a fanatic like me and highlight fingers as much as I'm doing here. Woo, part 4, freehand. Something different. So I just got up the old Night Lord's logo on the iPhone there. I'm just using it as a reference. Then we're going to crack out the Rakarth flesh and thin it right down with water. You can see how thin it was there. And let's just do a little dot on the very center of the armor. That is our reference. And from there we can branch out. We can branch out either side of that dot or a line and start adding the key components of what will be a skull. The skull that makes up the Night Lord's logo. You start with very simple lines, sort of mapping out where the eyes are and the nasal cavity. That's the center of a skull. Once we've got that, we can add the top of the jaw and the teeth. And then we'll probably add the cheekbones next. And then we'll start tracing out the top of the skull, the cranium. We'll fill in that forehead with this thinned down Rakarth flesh. And when we're freehanding like this, keep two things in mind. We want that paint super thin. Like, man, just so thin. We got to go over this again and again. So if this paint is not thin, it's going to look like a mess. It's going to be a bloody 3D freehand. You know, there's going to be so much paint on that. We're going to be sculpting it. We don't want that. We want super thin paint. The other thing we've got to keep in mind is that we're going over this again and again. And we don't need to worry about being perfect straight up. Like, bro, this skull is going to look pretty wonky. It's going to look ugly. It's going to go through many stages. It's going to go through stages where it looks all right, and then I'm going to add something that makes it just look dopey as. So keeping that paint thin is what we want, so that we can go over it and over it again with ease, and we don't need to worry about it turning 3D on us. Freehand is about constantly refining. And you've really got to give freehand a go. It's scary, I suppose, when you first start, but I started doing freehand at some point and I just winged it. I just was like, screw it, let's do it. Don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to give it a try. We're going to use Screaming Bell here for the wings, and that's going to tie in with the wings on his helmet. And we can use this to cut in to the skull a little bit, since the wings go either side. So the skull looks a bit fat at the moment, and so we can cut in. And as you can see, we've cut in a little bit too much, but that's fine. That's what it's all about. It's about refining, because now we're going to use a bit of Incubi Darkness, and we'll start fixing up some of the stuff. Start fixing up some of the things like the eyes and the nose. We'll add a line down the sides of the skull to define it, separate it from those red wings. Painting the tiny little nasal cavity. Sharpening up the cranium. Looks a little bit like a skull with a red mullet at the moment. But this is what I mean. It looks ugly for a while, and then it just all of a sudden gets to a point where it's like, oh, it actually looks okay now. And then if you keep refining it, and then you get to a point where it's like, bloody hell, that looks good, doesn't it? And because we had that line, that tiny little dot right at the start, we found the center point We're not going to paint this whole design and then after a while sit back and go, oh bloody hell, it's not centered, because that would not look good. If this was just off to the side a little bit, it would stand out like a sore thumb. So we really want to set ourselves up right from the start. Get that little dot in the center. And now we can concentrate on making things symmetrical. Keep checking the left side and the right side, making sure it looks symmetrical. Well, you can see that the top of the jaw, just under the cheekbone, is a little bit short on one side. So we're gonna add a little bit of Rakarth flesh in a minute, just to even it out. We can also use Incubi Darkness, like what we're doing here, and cut in. We're going to cut in on the bone here to thin that side and bring it a little bit back towards the other side. So we're switching between these three colors: Rakarth Flesh, Screaming Bell, and Incubi Darkness. We're just going back and forth between them. Now we're using Rakarth Flesh to make that side symmetrical. And we can use it to thin down that nose cavity a little bit. Make it a little bit smaller. The more detail you can add to these kinds of things, the more impressive it will look. Using the Incubi Darkness to cut in and sharpen up the teeth area as well as the copper wings. Making a clean slate so that we can paint some new teeth using Rakarth Flesh. Checking both of those sides, trying to get it symmetrical, as symmetrical as we can. Now let's add some teeth. Just tiny little dots, really. And then we'll try and push some of the jawbone in between each teeth if we can. Or at least just move that bone closer to the teeth. Here's the finished design for now. We'll come back to it a little bit later and finish it off, but there we go. That's good enough for now. Part 5, the black pipes. There are a lot of black pipes on this model. It's one of the largest areas of the model, I reckon, after the armor. So we're going to use Dark Reaper and thin it right down with water, and we'll just begin glazing it upwards towards where we want the highlights to be. Dark Reaper is grey, but it's a very bluish grey, so it's perfect for highlighting these black areas and adding a little bit of blue, because we want to try and get all of the elements to have a bit of blue so that they all have something in common with each other, and so that they also look like they're in the same dark nighttime environment. Now these pipes are all very wiggly and unique. They're really nicely sculpted. So we've got to give them a lot of attention and make them look good. They've got little knobbly bits and little twisty bits. They've got tears in them where the metal is showing through underneath. They're very interesting, so we need to try and give them the attention that they deserve. The black gun casing on the nozzle of the gun, we want to sort of direct that paint towards where the plasma is going to be, where those plasma coils are, because that's where it's going to be brightest, since that plasma is going to be casting light. These little black bits are going to catch that light. So when you think about those sorts of things, when we're highlighting around the plasma, we want to try and put the highlights on the sides that are going to be closest to the coils, not just for the black areas, but for things like the metal and the other pipes. We'll make sure that we hit these joints in the armor with Dark Reaper as well. Get the sneaky ones behind the legs. And don't forget about that little one hiding behind his cloak. Next we're using Administratum Grey. And thinning this down in the same way that we did the Dark Reaper, we're going to highlight those pipes just a little bit closer to the edge. And you can see that I've just placed the arms on the model so that we can highlight those black pipes without having to highlight unnecessary pipes that aren't going to be seen. So the arms aren't glued on. So if there's a pipe that we can see that is a little bit hard to get to, we can just take that arm off like we have here, so that we can paint these ones on the chests. Because these pipes on the chest and the abdominals, we can clearly see those pipes, but they're a bit difficult to paint and get to when the arm and the power maul is crossing over the body. So we can see them, but we can't get to them. So we just pop the arm back off, get to those pipes. These ones down here, they're very hard to get to because of the power maul is sitting right in front of them. And don't forget about those little pipes hiding underneath the greaves and sticking out into the ankles and the Achilles, like these ones. We want to make sure we really highlight all of these pipes and cables, because they're such a cool feature of the model. It's a very distinct model. I've never seen any other Warhammer model. It's got so much pipes on it, far out. Now we're highlighting the black components of the plasma pistol. All these sharp edges, we can double up on the highlight. You can double up the highlight on corners and things like that. And of course, the joints in this armor. And we want to continue the shine that we've put lots of work into creating. Going down the center of these limbs, you can see how just having that shine on even these little rubber power armor joints, just having it continue through that just goes a long way. You were just highlighting around those tears on the backpack. Pretty soon we'll get into highlighting the exposed metal, those exposed metal pipes. We'll highlight those up and make them look nice and shiny. Now we're going to use Abaddon Black and thin it right down with water, as you can see on the wet palette, using those beads of water. And we're going to flood this into the tears. This is just going to create a nice dark or black line defining both the metal areas and the rubber areas. We're also going to use it to darken up the pipes because we went a little bit far. We went a little bit far with the grey highlights. And when you highlight black, you've got to try and keep in mind not to go too far with those greys because it stops looking black and starts looking like grey. So we need to just easily fix that by glazing some Abaddon Black into the pipes. When you're highlighting black, you need the highlights to be quite stark. It needs to go from a very bright highlight to very dark, back to black really quickly. If there's too much surface area that's grey, it won't look like black. It'll look like dark grey. So anyway, let's get them back on track to being black. I briefly mentioned this earlier. We were very selective with what pipes we made black and what pipes we made skin color or the Rakarth flesh color. This is something you should always think about when you're planning on getting a bit of glow happening. Like we're going to be putting electricity and the sparks and all that on this fella. So we need to think about how are we going to get the best results out of that. And in my experience, glow works better when it's surrounded by dark areas because you have that contrast of really bright, intense power source, and that is surrounded by a dark area. It's naturally going to stand out a lot more. Imagine if you've got a really bright blue power glow coming out of a white area. It's not always going to work as well. It can work well. Like that's exactly what we did on the white scar. That was a bit of a challenge, and I wanted to try and challenge myself to see how we could make that work. But if you have the option to, try and design the model, lay out those colors, and choose the colors accordingly so that we can position as much black area or dark area around the power source as possible. Knock a bit of Abaddon Black into these joints in the armor. Get it in between the little ridges there. When we do the Dark Reaper glazing, inevitably we get some of that Dark Reaper going in between those ridges, losing a bit of contrast and definition. So we want to direct a little bit of that Abaddon Black in there. Now we're just jumping back to Dark Reaper, just to blend what we just did with that Abaddon Black. Just blending it back to the highlights a little bit. This is my process, as you'll learn. I like to jump back and forth between the colors, going up the highlight ladder and then back down the shade ladder. Just making things balanced and blended. I keep mentioning that we're using paint here, and we should always allow the model to evolve the way it needs to evolve. If we do too much of something, we can just knock it back with the previous color. Or if we do not enough of something, we can just layer up a bit more. Time to crank some of the Stormhost silver and we'll begin highlighting the internal sections of the pipes, the metal areas. We're just going to lightly highlight each one of those ridges. As you know, I paint a lot of Death Guard models. So every time I paint one of these things on a Death Guard dude, it gets rusted to the shithouse. So it's a bit of a new concept for me for this fella, not making these rusted. But we've hit it with a blue wash earlier. Yeah, we've done these lead belcher, and then they've had a Drakenhof Nightshade wash, and now they're getting highlighted with Stormhost Silver. We're going for a kind of clean but oily look. Now for the final stage of these black pipes and the black gun casing, we're going to use Ulthuan Grey, and we're just doing the very tops of these areas and just pinging them with a little white dot or a little Ulthuan Grey dot. Less is more with this color. Definitely don't want to go overboard with it and have to pull it back down again. If you do, probably use a little bit of Dark Reaper around the dot the offending dot that's gone a bit too hardcore and thick. But generally speaking, we want just little dots like this on the prominent areas, on the corners where there are tears, or on the peaks of any little knobbly bits or bulging bits from these pipes. Bits like this where it's protruding out of some kind of metal joint. And try not to go overboard with it. You can see how this shot right here, the whole model has got a bit of a shine thing happening. So we've got shine on the armor, shine on the tip of the toes there, bit of shine on the metal protruding from the pipes. Now we're continuing that theme, popping some little sparkles onto the black areas. Pick out these little rivets and the very edges of these little black panels on the gun. This backpack is going to look very sparkly. It's going to look really cool when we're finished with these little white dots here. Watch it just come to life, and it will start looking a lot more black when you do these little shines within those grey areas that we've highlighted. It just assists in that black look that we're after. Black needs to be well contrasted. It needs to go from almost pure white for the shines to full on black in the shadows, in the darker areas. Now we'll just go from pipe to pipe, picking out those little bright areas that we want to go ping with a bit of light. Make sure the paint's nice and thin, not so thin that it's going to be a little bit too transparent. Probably want this a little bit more opaque than we usually would use. You can see it starting to come to life with all those shines. Make sure we get these pipes here on his power maul or his bommy knocker. I don't know if anybody else has ever called a mace a bommy knocker, but when I was a kid, that's what they were called. Bommy knocker. Because you knock stuff, you knock bommies with it. I don't know what a bommy is, but you just knock them with it. The black pipes are now finished. We can come back and touch them up here and there later if we need to. But for now, they're good to go. Part 6. Skin pipes and bone. We're going to just highlight up these areas back with Rakarth Flesh. Hitting them with that Drakenhof Nightshade has made them a nice blue colour, which is perfect. But we just want to begin our highlighting stage by glazing some of that pure Rakarth Flesh back to the tops of those edges where we want those highlights to be. We want a bit of a highlight on the left side of this pipe, the side that's facing the plasma coils, because that's a power source and that's going to be casting light that way. Teeth, these sneaky buggers hiding here on the shoulder pad. We just want to pop a bit of Rakarth Flesh on them, as well as this skull here. Begin glazing this upwards. We want this skull to look nice and dark and blue and cold. Objects like this will catch the light from above. So that means we need to highlight the top areas of each section. That means the top of the head here. It means the top of the cheekbone, which effectively is the bottom of the eye socket. And do the same thing with the nose cavity there. Old mate Dark Reaper, let's get him out. And we're going to begin painting some bulging, triumphant veins in these fellas. So just as neatly as you can, start just painting some random lines here and there, make them sort of branch off like veins would. Use reference pics if you need them. And then we'll use Rakarth Flesh just to thin those lines back down. Don't put too much pressure on yourself expecting that you're going to get a perfect microscopic thin vein first time around. So you can thin them back down with Rakarth Flesh. And if you stick to the top side of those veins, it gives them a little bit of a 3D look. So like the light is catching them on that side, makes them look like they're bulging out of these skin pipes. And that the Dark Reaper becomes sort of the shadow. And these veins, this is just a really cool little detail that you can add. Whether you're painting a Death Guard model or some Gene Stealer dude, whatever. Veins go a long way in adding realism and detail. Now it's time for Druchii Violet. I always say it's the coolest of the washes. We're going to use it really with our really fine detail brush and just paint over some of the veins, some of the areas. Focus this color where the veins sort of intersect or branch off, making those areas look a little bit stronger and darker. Maybe they're bulging, got a bit of blood pumping through them or something. And we can also use it to sort of blend it into the darker areas of these pipes where it sort of tucks underneath another pipe like this, or it goes around one of the tears, making it look a little bit sore, or where it's coming out of the armor, out of some kind of socket or crack in the armor or whatever, like this. Just making those areas look a little bit darker, maybe a bit sore. It gives a little bit of a pink hue, a purpley pink hue, which you'll see relates later to the model when we add a bit of pink with the red plasma glow. It also makes this area stand out a little bit as an organic area. So this fella, he's walking around in very mechanical, industrial, hard surface type armor with all these black cables and electricity sparks. And then we've got these strange organic growths coming out of him. We're going to use Pallid Witch Flesh to highlight these pipes now. This color is very similar. It's on the same plane as Ulthuan Grey, but we want to use this instead because it has a little bit of a skin color, a bit of a pinkish hue to it, whereas Ulthuan Grey is more of a blue color. They're like brother and sister. This one's the girl version and Ulthuan Grey is the boy version. So we're just using this to just ping out those highlights, similar to when we were highlighting Ulthuan Grey on the black pipes. just in the very, very tops of these organic pipes. You can also use it to define a little bit of the veins if we need to here and there. We've got a couple of little tears and holes in this pipe. We'll just pick those out, as well as this top area where it tucks underneath the black pipe. We're giving it levels, different levels. So these pipes are kind of weaving and tucking underneath each other. So we want to really accentuate that coolness. And we do that with highlights and shadows. Now we're going to use Screaming Skull, which is like the half brother to Ulthuan Grey and Pallid Witch Flesh. This one's the yellow version. So we're going to use this to highlight the bones. And we got to remember that this is a skull and we want it to have a bit of a bone feel. So we need to give it a little bit of a bone color. And that's what Screaming Skull's all about. Giving a little bit of a yellow hue, but those underlayers, that Rakarth Flesh and Drakenhof Nightshade, they've laid the foundations to make it look nice and cold and blue. And this Screaming Skull is just giving it the bone that we need. We'll very lightly paint some lines going up those horns. And now we're going to switch to White Scar for the very tips, the very tops of these bone areas. Right on the peaks of the top of the head there, the peak of this nose, the nasal cavity, and under the eye sockets, as well as these teeth. We'll also pick out those teeth or those horns, the cheeky ones on the shoulder pad, right on the tip, as well as that one on the tip of the gun. Part 7, the bronze trim. Time for another major element of this guy. We'll just start off using Balthazar Gold, and just begin highlighting it up, bringing some a little bit back to life, giving it a bit of a shine. We want to retain that awesome coldness that the Drakenhof Nightshade has given it. We just want to kind of clean it up a bit, get our polishing on. So just here where we think it's going to give a nice shine, we're using this thin down Balthazar Gold and just pushing it into those areas, setting it up for a bit of a Sycorax bronze highlight later on. For this bronze, we're going a little bit unorthodox in our system here. Where in our operation, we're sort of going to jump between these three colors: Balthazar Gold, Drakenhof Nightshade, and Sycorax Bronze. Let's jump back and forth between these three colors as needed. When we want to darken up some areas, we'll use Drakenhof Nightshade. When we want to push some highlights, we'll use Sycorax Bronze. And when we want to blend those colors a little bit, if we've gone a bit far, knock it back with some Balthazar Gold. Here's a bit of Sycorax Bronze action. Popping out those highlights. And we want this bronze to look kind of classy, kind of old, maybe not quite ancient, but it's been through the ringer. It's been around for a while. We don't want it to look rusty or corroded or anything, because that's not the style we're going for here. We're not going for like a Death Guard filthy bugger. We're going for a different kind of mood. An old school kind of mood. A classic kind of gold that commands respect. Anyway, using our Sycorax Bronze, we're just doing a bit of edge highlighting and pushing the paint towards the points. especially on things like that horn. We want the tip of that horn to be quite shiny and prominent. We'll get the edges, the inner edges of the shoulder pad trim, always important. And we'll just take our time working our way around the model, making his trim look special, making him look like a boss. These sharp points, we want to really focus on getting them to a nice bright finish. They're going to be a lot sharper and more polished at those points. Jumping back and forth between the colors, we're using Sycorax bronze now, just shining up those edges and creating these little shines. We can really see this color combo of Balthazar gold washed with Drakenhof Nightshade and highlighted with Sycorax bronze. It's just what we want for this model. It's kind of muted. It's muted but classy and interesting. It's not taking any attention away from the rest of the model at all, but it's there and it's doing the job that it needs to do. Continue the shines that we've applied on the blue armor. Continue that through the bronze trim where possible. These corners here, or these little sections of the shoulder pauldrons, I like to put a little bit of a shine there. So we're just building that up here with some Balthazar gold. And blending a little bit of outwards where we've got a bit too much Drakenhof Nightshade going on, creating a little bit of a blend. Same deal with these spikes on his bomby knocker. Just making them get to a nice bright point. We want them a little bit darker at the base and brighter at the tip. We also want to try and enhance the edges of this fancy brass trim on the head of the power maul. Some of these cheeky, sneaky bits on the backpack. Make sure we get those. And now we're just continuing that shine down the center of this limb, this arm. We want to make sure that we continue that across all of the elements. If it's shiny on the blue armor and the black joint in the armor, but it wasn't shiny, it wasn't continuing that shine through the bronze, it would look a little bit unfinished. So make sure we just get that right there. Ping. You can see a few of those rivets need to be highlighted up too. We'll get to that. Got the arms just resting on the model, sitting there. So we can line this up, make sure we've got the highlight going along the tops of the shoulder pad trim and that they balance well. Back to Drakenhof Nightshade. What we're doing is we're pushing the depth of this bronze trim. Metal works best when it has a good strong contrast between dark and light, similar to what we talked about with the black pipes. We want this bronze trim to go very dark and very light. We're not going to go overboard. We're not going to use any black when highlighting this though. And this would be the first model I've painted in a very long time where I haven't used Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade. It's Drakenhof Nightshade what's doing all the heavy lift in here, isn't it? Get some of it around these rivets. Make them pop out, make them distinguished, make them look like they've been bashed into the armor, and they've got 3D shadows around them. I like to add a little bit of darkness in the centers of the trim. Just makes the edges look brighter without having to spend too much anguish trying to highlight them. When they're very shallow edges, sometimes it's hard to highlight those effectively, so you can, rather than highlighting them, darken the insides up a bit. Now we're just banging out the Stormhost Silver, and we're going to put this just on the very tips, the very pings and the very corners of the armor. Definitely don't want to go overboard with this. Stormhost Silver is basically grey with metallic, so we don't want to be highlighting too much. We don't want to be applying too much grey onto our bronze color. You can very easily go overboard highlighting gold or bronze with silver, so be careful with it. Less is more with this. So just find the very tips, the very points and sharpest areas of this bronze trim. We can whack a bit on these rivets too. I suggest that when you're picking a gold for the model that you're painting, whatever that model might be, that you have a real think about it. Have a think about what you want that gold to achieve, because a gold can make or break a model, in my opinion. Are you painting something imperial like an ultramarine or a white scar? Or are you painting something super fancy like a custode, where the gold's going to look really rich and vibrant and yellow? Or are we painting a Night Lord? If so, let's make that gold cold and dark and muted and not draw attention. Speaking of golds, let's turn the page to part 8, the copper wings. All we're going to do, we're going to use 2 colors for this. Drakenhof Nightshade is first up, and we're going to use this to shade it and create a bit of a blend. All we're going to do is push a bit of this Drakenhof Nightshade in between each section of the wings, where the sort of the membrane of the wing is, I guess. We're just going to do one coat like this, and then we're going to move on to the other wing. We're going to do a similar sort of operation on the backs of the wings, just pushing it upwards like that. So it's going to be brighter towards the bottoms. Now we're going to go back to it once it's dry and do another pass of Drakenhof Nightshade, but a bit closer to the tops. It's very easy. Same with on the other side. And then we're going to just do it a third and final time, right in the very tips, right up there, just like this. 3 passes we made, and it looks like that. Now we're going to get back to Screaming Bell and just lightly blend it outwards, thin it right down, of course, and just enhancing the shine on the outer edge of these red wings. We're just going to do this a couple of times, maybe 3 times, just like the Drakenhof Nightshade. 3 times dark and then 3 times light. And you can see it's really just starting to pop out. Just highlighting the edge with some Screaming Bell. We're only going to use these 2 colors for these wings, and they're going to look awesome. We're just using a Screaming Bell to edge highlight it now and pop out those sharp bits. And definitely don't forget about things like this, where it joins the blue armor. We really want to make that nice and distinguished. Separate it. We use the edge of the brush to highlight these membranes. Super easy. Then we're going to pick out the underside of these holes, these pocks or damaged areas. And that's all there is to it for these copper wings. We've managed to make something pretty interesting, which could have just been a bunch of red stuff. Instead, we've created a cool focal point for the head using a really interesting copper color and shaded down with a blue wash to help tie it in with that cold night theme. Part 9, the head details. Got a few little random bits and pieces on the head. We're going to use lead belcher first and highlight up these gas canisters popping out of the sides of his cheeks. Now we're using Stormhost Silver to accentuate those highlights. Pop them out a little bit, make them look nice and shiny. We'll get a bit of a highlight on the back of his head here. We're just simply going to use Pallid Witch Flesh, and we'll thin it right down and just sort of glaze it towards the top of the head. We're not going to go too fancy with this skin. This is all there is to it. We've had Rakarth Flesh and then Drakenhof Nightshade. Now we're just highlighting it up just like that so that it looks nice and cold and pale. He's a Night Lord, so he hasn't seen much daylight. Part 10, the leather. We're going to hook out the Baneblade Brown and thin it right down. Just using the wet palette there and the water that we've got on hand. We'll start with the strapping on the Bommy Knocker. And we're going to just pick a line. We're going to just, on each strap, add a little line going down the shaft of the weapon. And this is going to be kind of the focal point, or it's going to be the highlight zone of the rod. We want this line to be sort of like the shine. And when the piece is in place, sitting on the model, we want that shine to be sort of at the top, going along the top of the shaft. What we're doing now is blending into that line. Within each strap, just blending it upwards, making it nice and smooth, a bit of a gradient. So we'll just get closer and closer to that line on each strap. We'll use a bit of this Baneblade Brown to highlight the edges of the belt going around his waist. We don't want this to be as pale as the strapping. We want to retain the kind of dark leather look. We're just sort of highlighting the edges here. And you can sort of stipple the edges so that it looks like the leather is kind of old and cracked and sort of got little tears and all that. His little money pouch here with his gold coins. We'll get a bit of Baneblade on that. Brighten them up a bit. Do a little bit of work to it, make it look good. And just keep going over it and over it until we're happy with it. Then we'll jump back to some Drakenhof Nightshade and we'll go back to the strapping, and we're just going to blend this downwards and create a bit of a shadow along the bottom of the shaft. Three things we're doing with this Drakenhof Nightshade. We're blending it into the bottom of the shaft to create that shadow. The second thing we're doing is what we're doing here. We're putting it in between each strap to create a bit of depth. And the third thing we're doing is we're putting it into any tucks where some straps tuck underneath other straps, just to create a bit of depth. We want to make the bottom side of the shaft darker than the top. We'll of course get a little bit of this Drakenhof Nightshade on the money pouch and the leather belt. and force a bit of this Drakenhof Nightshade into where the belt tucks under this belly plate thing. We'll quickly just go back to Rakarth Flesh, and we're just going to very nicely, very carefully highlight the edges of each strap. I'm just trying to be very neat and very fine, get a really sharp highlight on the edge of each one of these straps. And you can do a little bit of stipple action like this, making each strap look like it's got a bit of tearing or it's sort of starting to fray. That can always make the straps look a bit more interesting. You can also put some little scratches and little rips in the straps here and there. So we've created all the shadows. Now we're just defining all the elements, defining each strap, defining the belt, and defining his money pouch. And of course we'll pop out some of those tears in his belt. Part 11, the cloak. Now we're going to do a fairly simple cloak here. We want this cloak to just look dark and ominous. We don't want it to look fancy. I considered putting some freehand on it, but I think there's enough going on with this model. Didn't need any more freehand on the back. What we want to do is create just a nice, smooth, blended cloak. Just a black cloak, man. Reflecting a bit of the blue night sky. We're just using Dark Reaper and just got it kind of thinned down, but not much. Just make sure the paint's sort of flowing consistently and smoothly. We're just painting some opaque layering down. We're laying down some opaque Dark Reaper just on the high side of each fold. Nothing to it. It's you can use a big fat brush for this. We don't need to be doing any kind of fine detail here. Just really roughly mapping out the top side of each crease. We're going to do a similar concept of blending here to what we did with the armor. We're painting these opaque solid colors, and then we're going to blend it back down with the previous color. So in a minute we're going to use some Abaddon black to blend this Dark Reaper into the black areas. Just wipe a bit of the paint off and get a bit of a dry brush action going on here, just to pick out the bits of fur here. It's not full on dry brush, like we're not using a dry brush, and the paint's not as rubbed off as you'd want for a proper dry brush. We're just really roughly picking them out. That's all we're doing, just finding that detail so that we know where everything is and we can highlight it properly in a minute. Time to hang out with some Abaddon black for a little while. We've thinned this right down. We're going to glaze this now and just blur the line between the Dark Reaper and the Abaddon black inside the folds. That's all there is to it. It's not difficult at all this stage. Just go over it a few times and get it a little bit closer and closer to that black area, and you'll see that it starts to just blur together, which is what we want. When you're doing a black cloak like this, you don't want to go the other way. You don't want to be using Dark Reaper to blend. You don't want the Dark Reaper to be the thin color that you're blending over black, because it will look streaky and chalky. We want to do what we've done here, where we just map out those opaque Dark Reaper colors, and then we're going to use the stronger color, which is the Abaddon black. We're using that to pull it back. That's a very important thing. You'll never get a very smooth cloak if you're using really thin layers of Dark Reaper. And just add some shadows here and there where you think it needs it. And we don't want to forget about this area here. This is seen from the front of the model. It is kind of hidden by by the gun, but we still want to give it a bit of attention. We'll also thin some of this Abaddon Black down sort of into a bit of a wash and just wash it over this fur and just pull that dodgy dry brushing that we did, pull that all together. Darken it back down. We'll go and get out the old Dark Reaper again, get back to it, and we're going to just brighten up some of those Dark Reaper areas that we just glazed over with the Abaddon Black. Some of the areas we might have taken a little bit out here and there, a little bit too much Dark Reaper away, and we just want to bring that back a little bit. As I was saying though, we want to be really careful. We don't want to be glazing this over all of the black areas. We're just brightening up some of the Dark Reaper areas. If we start getting this all over the black, we're going to get streaks, and it's going to look chalky, and it's not going to look very smooth. So we'll just try and keep this to the Dark Reaper areas and just brighten them up a little bit. We'll just pick out these claws with Rakarth Flesh. We're going to paint them in a very similar way to the rest of the bone. We're not in any kind of real hurry with this. We just want to take our time and make sure we do a few thin coats and not get it onto the nice armor or the gold. We don't want to have to clean that up again for the sake of some like rat claws or whatever they are. And some more Dark Reaper. This time we're using our fine brush, and we're going to paint each little tuft of fur. It's not as monotonous as it sounds. It didn't take long, only a few minutes. And we want to paint sort of about 80%, I reckon, of each tuft of fur, just leaving that Abaddon Black in the gaps and at the base of each little bit of fur. Just going to quickly work our way around this rat fur coat, this black rat coat, whatever it is. Maybe it's a wolf. Well, it's obviously a wolf, isn't it? The dude's Black Legion, isn't he? And correct me if I'm wrong, but Black Legion used to be Lunar Wolves, so they got a wolf thing going on. He's Horus's boy, isn't he? Horus has got a wolf on his shoulder, isn't it? Regardless of what it is, it's got to be black. This could have easily been a brown fur coat, but that's just going to take way too much attention away. It's not going to mix with our color palette very well. We want this dude dark and ominous. He's walking around at night time with his dark blue armor, his big bomby knocker. He's wearing a black fur coat. It's not beige or brown or pink or some nonsense like that. It's got to be black. Anyway, it's not taking long to get this done. It only took a few minutes. You don't have to be too precise with it. Just knocking out about 80% of each one, aren't we? That's how it should look. While we're cranking the Dark Reaper, let's go and do a bit of an edge highlight on this cloak area. We'll hit these edges, and we'll hit the edges of the tears. Like these ones right here. This doesn't need to be a perfectly thin highlight because we're going to do a brighter highlight over it later on. We always got to make sure we get the bottom hem. Righto, let's do the first coat of Drakenhof Nightshade on the claws. We're going to do a couple of coats of this. Here's the first one right here. And we're just going to get that Drakenhof Nightshade and push it towards the base of each claw. That's where we want it to be darkest. Easy. While that's drying, let's bang out the Dawnstone. Now we're going to do the same thing that we did earlier with the Dark Reaper. We're going to paint these tufts of fur, but we're going to be a little bit more fine with it. We're not going to paint 80% of each one. I reckon we'll paint about 40% of each one. Maybe even 30%, whatever. What we're doing is we're just painting the tip of each tuft of fur with our fine detail brush. And we're just bringing them to life a little bit and popping them out. And you'll see that it doesn't take long for this fur to start looking good. This is quite an easy and relaxing and reasonably fast process. But if you didn't want to do this, you could always dry brush it, I suppose. If you're going to dry brush anything, you're going to dry brush fur, aren't you? The sculpting on this fur is pretty good though. It's pretty well defined and easy to pick out the detail. You can see we're just kind of putting a few random ones here and there, like doubling up with a few random tufts just to make it a little bit more random and unique, as fur would be. It's not all going to look exactly the same, is it? And we want to sort of double up a little bit on the tops, on the top section of the fur, so it looks a little bit brighter up the top. We always want to sort of make the top of the model brighter than the bottom. So this is just another way of getting that done. Go back to the second coat of Drakenhof Nightshade on these rat claws, just getting a little bit closer to the base of them, making them nice and dark down there. Now we'll highlight up those claws using Administratum Grey, blending them towards the tips, so they're obviously going to be brighter at the tips and darker at the base. And we're going to make these look nice and grey and cold, not like your typical bone-coloured claws. We've got to think about how to make every single element of this model cold while we're painting it. Just going to pop out the tips of those claws and the edges with white scar. Yeah, so always think about that while we're painting this. We want this guy to look cold and like he's walking around at nighttime. So even little things like claws can help tell that story. There we go, the claws are finished. And for now, the cloak is finished too. We're going to come back later on and do a final highlight. But for now, we're just going to leave that till later, because if we're going to handle it, we don't really want that to be rubbing off. So we'll save that for last. There's a few little bits of silver lying around. So part 12, we're going to paint that silver. Using lead belcher, we'll just pick out some of these areas on the gun first. Always got to make sure we highlight that nozzle, the gun barrel. That always needs to be kind of clean and sharp looking. And we're just very loosely painting this really. Don't really have to be too fine with what we're doing. This metal has been painted lead belcher and has had a Drakenhof Nightshade wash over it, so all we're doing is just bringing up some of that surface metal back to a bit of a shine, not quite so dull. However, we want to leave that, well, some of that Drakenhof Nightshade, we want some of that lying around, we want some of it in the gaps, and we want it stained on some of the surfaces. We're just using it, lead belcher, to just polish it back up a bit, prepare it for the shines to come. And of course we're going to use Stormhost Silver to create these shines and the little pings on the corners of the metal. We'll be creating a bit of plasma glow here later, so we want to make sure that we get that edge around the plasma coils. Make that nice and bright, setting it up for some cool glow. Rip into it. Just go around all of the metal areas and highlight the edges. There's absolutely nothing to it. We're getting these exhaust pipes again. And to prepare for the cool plasma glow we're going to do, we just need to clean up those coils with Abaddon Black. Part 13, Red Hot Glow. This is where it's happening over here. We're going to be using some pigment, some bright, intense pigment. Check it out. Super bright, isn't it? Let's scoop some of it out and just whack it down there on the wet palette. And we'll mix it in with a bit of Vallejo matte varnish. Blend it together into a bit of a slurry. Then we'll switch to our fine brush and paint a little dot in the center of the eye. And here we go. We've got some quality filming for you. Sorry about that. I think I need to get some contact lenses or something there. And I completely block out the next shot too, so we'll pause it there. What I've done is I've just put a whole bunch of dry pigment in each of those eye sockets. It's almost like flooding it with a wash, but we're using dry pigments. Unpause. Now we're continuing using a little bit of dry pigment around the outside of the eye sockets. And we're just creating a bit of glow effect using a pigment, using it completely dry. Get some pigment on the brush and put it on the eye socket and start feathering it around the place. It's very easy, and you can create a really intense glow almost instantly. The pigment of those eyes is very, very hot and vibrant. Dip the brush in a little bit of clean water and we can begin going over that glow a little bit, and it just sort of sets the pigment, melts it down into a bit of a paint, and we can feather it out and blend it away. We'll put some glow on these gas canisters as well, intensifying the glow and making it look like it's reflecting on those metal areas, as well as this bit here in the center of his forehead, little pointy bronze bit. We'll get some glow on there. Mix up that same kind of paste and we're going to create plasma. We're going to make this a little bit different. We'll put it into the crease here, and it's kind of acting like a bit of a wash because we've got it quite runny. But what we're going to do is something a bit different. We're going to make this plasma gun on standby. So it's not going supercharged and ready to melt faces or anything like that. It's just idle. It's glowing quietly, maybe humming, whatever. But we still want it to look very dark and scary and evil. So we're getting it really, really intense in that crease. Once we've got some of that wet pigment in there, we can pull it upwards in between each plasma coil like so. We'll go back and forth, doing this a couple of times, just adding more and more pigment. And you'll see it just gets very hot looking. But it's not going to be overpowering. My thinking here is that I don't want this plasma gun going mental and going supercharged and glowing and making everything just reflect red. I don't want to draw too much attention away from the center of the model. this gun's kind of hanging out the side. It's way out the side of the model. So if we've got a whole bunch of crazy ass glow happening, causing a whole bunch of mischief all the way out there in no man's land, it's going to be very distracting, isn't it? We're not going to really know what to look at first. So let's have a think about that when we're designing the model. And we've got to come up with a solution. And the solution here is to make this plasma gun on standby, just glowing a little bit. And from the top, it's going to remain quite black. It's only going to have this intense red on the sides. Now we're thinning that pigment down into a bit of a wash, similar to how we did the glowing eyes. But we've got a little bit more water in it this time. And we're applying this around the outside of the plasma coils, all over the metal and these black pipes. But we're not going to go overboard with it. Going back to the eyes, we are going to add a little bit more focus to the center of them. Using riser rust, going to thin it down like so into a usable paint. So it's no longer going to be a dry paint. Get your fine detail brush and pop a little bit of this riser rust in the center of each eye. Fire Dragon Bright, we're going to do exactly the same thing, except a slightly smaller dot inside that riser rust circle. Remember right at the start in part 1 when we were doing our color theory, I wasn't quite sure about what kind of red I wanted this to be, whether it was going to be an orange red or a red or have a bit of pink in it. Wasn't sure. So I'm kind of experimenting here and adding orange to the red, highlighting the eye sockets as well, and adding a little bit to the outside of the plasma glow. Just a little bit. We definitely don't want to go overboard with it and change the color of that red too much. We don't want it to go too orange. And by adding that orange, we can see that it's going a little bit fiery looking. We need to define these eyes a little bit more. We're going to thin down a little bit of Abaddon black and paint just underneath each eye, very slightly. We're pretty much painting an eyelid. Well, it looks like an eyelid. And you can see it's just defined those eyes a little bit more. We're going to accentuate the plasma coils a little bit just by adding a tiny bit of watered down Mephiston red in between each of the plasma coils on the top. Just showing a little bit of love to this area. We don't want it to just be a solid black area with no paint happening on it. You can see here we're just letting the paint flow in between each plasma coil, and it's very, very subtle. We're only lightly tinting that black area, making it feel a little bit hotter there. I guess we're also adding some of this watered down Mephiston red to the plasma glow. Sure, why not? No doubt we're going to add some around the eyes as well. Keeping it consistent, I suppose. Screamer Pink, I really want to make this plasma and these eyes have a little bit more of an unnatural feel. The orange, the fiery orange is cool, but yeah, I just want a bit more of a magical or unnatural kind of heat. This guy is very electric. He's going to be having sparks and electricity and all that sort of stuff coming out of him. So I really want to get almost like an electrical, magical type heat going here. So we're just thinning down some Screamer Pink and blending that into the mix. Putting some around the plasma glow as well. We're not going to worry about putting any of it inside the plasma glow for now. We'll focus on keeping it to the exterior. Putting it on the pipes and the bits of metal and all that stuff. I lie, we're going to put a little bit on the plasma coils. Just a little bit though. Emperor's Children. This is a pretty cool color. We're just going to focus this on some of the highlights of the red areas. The bottom of this nasal cavity. We'll put a little bit on the bottom of the eye sockets. And a little bit in the center of the eye. It's thinned down, so it's just glazing over that orange that we did before, just giving it a very slight hint of pink. Definitely we want to get some of this pink on the gas canisters coming out of his helmet. That metal is going to reflect the colors, so we definitely want some of that pink in there. And of course we'll put some Emperor's Children in the glowing area around the plasma gun. You can see what I mean, how this glow isn't taking too much attention. It's certainly interesting, but it's not distracting. We're going to use white scar to paint a tiny little dot in the center of each eye, and a few tiny little pings of light on these very sharp bits, and we'll speckle it along here to make that look like it's kind of sparkly, that little wire, electrical wire there. The glowing eyes and the plasma on standby are now finished. Part 14, Eyeball Part 1. Hook out the Rakarth flesh, give it a quick base coat. Then we'll give it a quick wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. And that's it for part 14. We'll come back to this later and we'll let this just dry for now. We're going to work on something else. And that would be the electricity, part 15. Ceramite white. Thin this down with a little bit of water and start painting this into the cracks where we're going to create some electrical sparks, which will translate to our classical Night Lord lightning, or our interpretation of it. It's very easy. What we're doing here is literally just letting this thin down ceramite white flood into the gaps on its own. The cracks are already there in the sculpting, so all we're doing is letting the paintbrush touch those cracks, and the ceramite white's just flooding out of it and filling those gaps, filling those little cracks, and that's going to become the power source for our lightning. And we're going to create a little bit of glow coming off that. And if we want to create awesome glow, we need a power source. We need something that's causing the glow. Whether it be the center of the plasma coils or the center of the eyeball, whatever's the hottest area or the most intense area. And for this, it's just purely ceramite white, and that's electrical energy sparking from within inside the armor. We can begin venturing away from some of these cracks, like so, just painting some very thin lines and getting a little bit more of that lightning pattern. Trying to make it look like sparks are starting to venture across the armor. Got to control the paint a little bit on your finger there, because it can get away from you. Don't really want to put too much on. We want this lightning on this fella to be a little bit subtle. We don't need to go overboard and make lightning sparks all over the place. Each one of these is going to be quite intense, really. So if we have them all over the place, it's just going to look very busy. So we don't need to even put this effect in every single spark. We can just do most of them or some of them. Here we're having a bit of fun and venturing out, creating a bit of a lightning strike. We can afford to put that here on this panel because it's quite bare. Now we're going to use Incubi Darkness and thin it right down. And this is going to do two things. The first is that it's going to thin down some of those lightning strikes, or the little sparks, whatever you want to call them. We can refine them and make them a little bit thinner and more detailed. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to tint it slightly. It's going to give it a little bit of a blue, a little bit of a green tinge even. And that's creating almost an immediate bit of glow, because the color is quite transparent, and when we paint over the white, it's not going to make that white completely disappear. It's going to tint it and make it look blurry and fuzzy and a lighter blue. And when that light blue is sitting right next to that intense ceramite white, it's creating a natural glow. I'm liking how this spark is shaping up here on his shoulder pad here. This becomes my favorite spark, I think. Also, we want to put a little bit of this Incubi Darkness on the pipes, just where they're coming out of the cracks. That's going to help dictate a bit of glow. Because they're right next to the sparks, of course they're going to be taking on some of that electric blue color. So we're going to put a little bit of that Incubi Darkness, just quite subtly. Don't want to go overboard with it, especially on the black pipes. Just put a little bit of it at the base where it's coming out of those cracks. Now going to use Lothern Blue, and it's going to look like lightning now. This is a very intense, well, it's quite an intense blue really, isn't it? And we're going to thin it right down with water and just glaze it towards each crack. And we can go over a little bit of the white here and there, and we can leave some of that white pure and shining through. We don't want to go over all of it, but certainly we want to tint some of that white. And in doing so, we're going to get a lot of nice variation. A lot of variation of color. Here you can see we're just putting a little bit of that thinned down Lothern Blue on the base of that black pipe, creating a little bit of a glow. And we can start a couple of mils away from each crack, each lightning strike, and just push some of that thinned down Lothern Blue into that area, and it's creating really quick, easy blends. This doesn't even take long to do. This is really easy. I only make a couple of passes with this. You will see, however, the more passes you do, the more intense that blue gets. So, for the sake of variation, you want to do a couple of passes in some areas and maybe 3 or 4 passes in other areas. Yeah, just to get a bit of variation. Some bits are going to be really, really bright blue, and other bits are going to be full on white, and other bits are going to be more of a dark blue. But always keep in mind the theory of creating good glow is having a really pure light source at the center, and that intense color is glazed around that source and towards that source, and it fades away the further it gets from that source. We'll have a break from the lightning strikes for now, and we're going to create a bit of glow on his bombing knocker. You can see I've chopped those silly lightning bolts off his bombing knocker. They just weren't working. But anyway, whatever. This is going to be much better. All we're doing is we're just highlighting around each of these 3 circles in the center of the mace. Now we're going to use thin down ceramite white, just like we did with the cracks. And have a squiz at how easy this is, mate. All we're doing is touching the tip of the brush to the center of each hole. And because the ceramite white is quite thin, it's like a wash, it just does the work for you. It just runs out and fills that hole. It's so easy. We don't even need to do any touching up at all. This is how you fill a hole with paint. And it's going to be really intense as well. That's just one coat. Done. Time to glue it to the body. We're going to glue both of the arms to the body now. The time has come. Scrape away some of that paint and use a bit of plastic glue. Careful not to get that on your nice paintwork. Otherwise it's going to melt. You're going to melt that paint straight off, so be careful. Make sure you don't have any on your fingers when you're doing this. And this arm needs to be squeezed together nice and tightly so there's no gaps. Using Incubi Darkness, we're going to rip into blending our first layer of glazes on the bombing knocker. This Incubi Darkness is doing 2 things. One, it's introducing a little bit of darkness to the bombing knocker so that the glow has something to contrast against. And the other thing it's doing is just tinting it to a little bit of a blue. Now, in exactly the same way as we did the lightning, we're just using Lothern blue, thinned right down with water, of course, blending it around each of these white holes. We'll do as many passes as you need, but that's what one pass looks like, just like that. And you'll see just how much difference a second pass is going to make in a minute. The second pass is effectively going to duplicate that glazing that we've just done, and really it's going to double the effect, double the brightness and the vibrancy. It's going to look good when we finish this. You wait and see. We'll add a little bit to the bronze areas, just on the edges where it's going to reflect a little bit of glow. Feel free to spill a little bit of this Lothern blue over the ceramite white areas. That's fine. So have a look. That's what 2 passes looks like. And we've done that. We've done probably about 3 passes over the entire thing. Now we're going back to our thinned down ceramite white and going to put a little bit more in the center of each white hole, and that's going to finish it off. You can see it's glowing pretty nicely. Well, we've got the ceramite white out. We're going to quickly go over some of the lightning strikes and some of the sparks, and pick some of them out and enhance them with a bit more white. Just here and there, wherever you think needs a little bit of a boost. Now at this point, we'll have a quick squiz at the model, and I'm really liking how that intense electric blue is working with that really hot red pink. Part 16, finish the freehand. All we've got to do here is get some Drakenhof Nightshade and add a little bit of a shadow, a little bit of a downward gradient over the design. just so that it's not a 2D thing just floating around. It needs a bit of shadow. We'll thin down some incubi darkness and apply a little bit of a shadow, a little bit more of a 3D effect, not too much, just a little bit on the forehead and under the cheekbones here. Make it look a little bit more 3D and interesting. Simple as that. Now we're going to hook out the screaming skull and highlight the top of the skull, blending it upwards to create a bit of a nice gradient, a nice blend. We've pretty much used the same color in this skull as we have for the other skulls on the model. We'll quickly add a little bit underneath the eye sockets and underneath the nasal cavity. And then we're all done. We're all done with the freehand. There he is. There's the little guy. Hello. The Night Lord's logo. Part 17. Eyeball Part 2. Going to use Screaming Skull and begin blending the white of the eye. Make it look a bit lighter towards the top of this section. It's kind of a strange design, this eye. It's quite bumpy and weird looking, but it's cool. Anyway, Evil Sun Scarlet. Give it the old 1-2. 2 thin coats over the center of the eye, or the iris. What will become the iris. Then we're going to use Emperor's Children and blend a little bit of this downwards. Get a bit of a gradient happening where it's pink at the bottom. And to tie this eye in with the red eyes on the helmet, we'll add a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright. And we'll now paint the outside of this iris using Abaddon Black. As thin as you can, as neatly as you can, paint around the circumference of it. And then we'll just fix that up again, thin that line down a little bit because we went a little wonky here and there with Emperor's Children. We'll use a bit of Evil Sun Scarlet as well and just stipple it. Back to Abaddon Black. Get your hand nice and steady and we're going to paint a pupil. And I'm just going to make mine a slit, kind of like a snake eye. This is totally snake eyes. Thin down some Screamer Pink and add it to the base of the eye around the white section, just to give the idea that it's kind of a little bit bloodshot and a bit nasty. Back to Screaming Skull, highlighting that white section. Focus it on the tops and just clean up around that iris. Got a little bit of pink and a little bit of black on that section, so this is what we use to fix it up. Bit of Screaming Skull. And as I was saying before, it's a bit of a funny shaped eye. It's got all little knobbly bits and wonky bits, and it's got some dents and cracks in it. Don't really know what's going on with it, but we're just going to highlight all of those bumps and cracks and accentuate them because they're pretty cool. Part 18. Finish them details. Just using Abaddon Black, and I'm going to put it into these, in between these joints here in the armor. We haven't used one speck of black on that armor, so we want to define a few of those really deep areas, like these bits around here, around where he's holding the gun. Some of these bits between the fingers, they're just not quite dark enough. The other thing we're going to do is clean up this plasma gun a little bit. We're going to paint the tops of these plasma coils with Abaddon black. Clean them up, because when we did that Mephiston red wash over them before, or that glaze, we made a little bit of a mess, so we'll just clean that up with some Abaddon black. Let's get a little bit more in love with these plasma coils and hook out the Skavenblight Dinge once again. We'll focus a little bit of this on the corners of each plasma coil, painting a little bit and pulling it towards the corner, along the tops as well as on the side. And when we're painting it on the side, we'll pull it upwards towards that corner, so it's strongest in the corner. Doing exactly the same thing, only this time with Dawnstone. Getting our love on with these plasma coils. Going to lightly kiss it on the very corner of each plasma coil. There we are. It's got a little bit more of a finesse to it now. Righto. Using Thunderhawk Blue, we're going to finish off the cloak. All we're going to do with Thunderhawk Blue is edge highlight the cloak. Using the side of the brush, and all we're going to do is run it along the edge of the cloak. Make sure we get the bottom hem. It's always very important to paint the bottom hem of the cloak or any kind of robes that you're painting. Same thing, but we're going to use Ulthuan Grey, highlighting the bottom of the hem and all of the edges and the tears in this cloak. And I didn't want to do this before because we've been handling this model a lot, and I just didn't want to have all this paint rubbing off while we're handling it. We're getting nearer to completing this model now, so it's okay to get this finished now. We'll use a bit of this Ulthuan Grey to pick out some of the tufts of fur. We'll try and keep this focused to the top of the model. As I always say, we want the top of the model brighter than the bottom. This is going to help us look at the top of the model, and our attention is going to be drawn towards the face. Now we'll use plastic glue to glue the backpack on. Stormhost Silver. Bang it out. We're going to use it to do a once over. We're going to highlight any bits of metal that look like they need fixing, or that includes the silver as well as this bronze, especially on these spikes. As I said before, we've been handling this model. These spikes have already been highlighted, so we're having to re-highlight them now because I've been handling the model. So we're doing a once over, giving them a bit of a cleanup. And you want to go and do this with any other colors that you reckon might have been damaged a little bit. But here we go. Look at him. He's looking pretty bad to the bone, isn't he? He's just missing one thing. A base. Part 19. Ice base. It's been sprayed Chaos Black, but we're just going to clean it up with Abaddon Black. We're going to paint the Space Marine using Doombull Brown. This fella's going to be a Blood Angel. Of course, this paint has been thinned right down, so we're going to do 2 or 3 very thin coats of this. Now, I'll tell you about this later, but I've actually had to make this base twice. This one here that I'm painting, it gets buggered up, it gets wrecked. But not to worry, because I'll make another one. A better one. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Using Nuln Oil, all we're doing here is just putting this into all of the gaps and all of the joints, all of those little divides between the panels, defining each area. Now we're going to use Mephiston Red, and all we're doing is we're just glazing a little bit of this onto the armor, giving it a little bit more of a red color. And this is going to be focused in the center of the model and the top of the model, so where you think the light's going to be strongest. We can create a little bit of a shine here and there, as we did with the Night Lord on his armor, but we don't need to go too overboard with this, because this fella is actually going to be encased in ice. This poor Space Marine, he's probably going to live for like 100 years or maybe even 1,000 years trapped under this ice. His suit's going to just keep him alive. It's quite tragic. I think I actually feel a little bit sorry for the poor bastard. Anyway, this Mephiston Red, what it's doing is just brightening up this armor a little bit, making it look a little bit more like a Blood Angel. And later on we're going to add some cold blues to it to make him look a bit frosty. And you could do the same thing if you wanted to paint a different legion. For example, if you wanted to paint a salamander, just paint it however you want, in the greens that you want, and then you do the same blue highlights that we're going to do later on to frosty it up a bit. This is Scrag Brown, and we're using this to build up the highlights. Doing a bit of edge highlighting as well as a bit of glazing. Just make this Space Marine look as best as you can make him. We've put a lot of work into the Night Lord, and there's no reason why we shouldn't put a lot of work into the base. This is a hero model, so we want him to look his best. Now we'll, of course, use Abaddon Black to paint all of the joints in the armor. Clean them up a bit. As well as the wings on his chest, the Aquila. You'd paint this gold if you were doing some other legion, if you want. We're going to pick out the eyes. We're going to make the eyes black. If you've got any gold, use Balthazar gold, or whatever gold you want really. But we're using Balthazar gold and lead belcher for the pipes in his face. Using Dark Reaper, we'll highlight the black areas. And of course we want to use Dark Reaper for this because there's a lot of blue in it. And this guy is going to end up quite blue looking. He's going to look pretty cold. He doesn't at the moment because his armor is very red and orange and very hot, but we're going to change that completely. What we're doing is we're painting a Space Marine the way he should look, and then we're going to modulate him. We're going to change that by doing some blue glazes later on. Using Dawnstone just to highlight those joints in the armor. And this hand is going to be sticking out of the ice, so you want to pay special attention to the hand. This hand is as important as any other element on the Night Lord himself. Administratum Grey. Pick out the very fine details of the black sections, like the very tips of the wings on the Aquila, and the prominent areas of that skull in the middle of it. So we can just use the side of the brush there and it kind of finds the detail itself. We'll do a final highlight of these black areas with Ulthuan Grey. You can see we've tried to create a bit of a shine on this part of the armor joints. And we want this Aquila to look nice and shiny as well. So using the Ulthuan Grey just kind of pings those areas, makes them shining bright. And of course we want to highlight those eyes. Normally Blood Angels have green eyes, but we want these eyes to look cold and lifeless, like he's powered down or something. He might even be dead, I don't know. But I think he's still alive in there, and I think he's just powered down. He's in hibernation mode or something. We'll use a little bit of Kislev flesh to highlight the very corners of the armor. And as I was saying before, we're just painting a Space Marine the way we would if he was just walking around. Don't worry about him being trapped in ice right now. We're just painting him in any normal way. This is pretty much how I would paint a Blood Angel, I reckon, using these colors. And then later on, when he's almost finished, we're gonna do some blue washes over him to make him look really cold. So whether you're painting a Salamander here, or a Black Templar, or an Ultramarine, or a Blood Angel, whatever, just paint it the way they would if they were alive and walking around, if they were healthy. Because now we're going to use Drakenhof Nightshade, and we're just going to glaze this over the entire model, and this is going to darken it as well as give it all a blue hue. So it's going to start looking a bit colder now. As with the Night Lord, we don't want to do too much of this Drakenhof Nightshade, and we don't want to undo all of the nice glazing and highlighting that we've done. We just want to tint that armor. And then for this model, I'm using Ulthuan Grey to do the final highlight. However, as I mentioned before, I made two of these bases because this one that you see here, it gets wrecked. So the second one I made, I did a little bit differently. I did 4 things differently. The first thing that I did differently is before I did this stage here with the Ulthuan Grey, and right after I did the Drakenhof Nightshade, I glazed over the model with thinned down Lothern blue, and that made a huge difference. It made a massive difference. So make sure you do that, no matter what you're painting. If it's a Salamander or a Black Templar or whatever, Lothern blue is the color that you want to make it look frosty and icy. And then you can carry on doing what we're doing here, which is Ulthuan Grey, highlighting the very tips. We're also glazing this Ulthuan Grey and venturing it out into the center of the panels, which you wouldn't normally do with Ulthuan Grey because it can look very chalky. And that's not a very nice look, but it actually works really well for this because it gives it a frosty look, like there is ice all over him. So feel free to glaze a little bit of this Ulthuan Grey into the main sections of the red armor. And you'll see that it makes it look very frosty, which is what we want for a fella that's trapped under ice. So here's the other version I made of this base, and this is the one that I end up using in the final. And here you can see the second thing that I did differently, and that's when we were painting that very first layer of Doomball Brown. I just blended a little bit of it into the black area, and that just makes him look like he's sinking into the darkness. He's not just magically floating there with half a body. And you can see the third thing that I've done differently is I added a little shoulder pad there. The fourth thing is that his hand that's reaching out, I made it reaching upwards more. It's not leaning back so much. Check it out. Here's the final version. And you can see what a massive difference that Lothern blue glaze has made. It's a massive difference. It's so much better. He looks so cold right now. He's ready for his ice bath. We're going to mix up some epoxy resin and just follow the instructions, whatever brand you're going to use. Make sure you try and stir it nice and slowly like this so that you don't get bubbles in it. And if you're anything like me, you're going to get shitloads of bubbles in it, no matter what you do. So you can do whatever you can to try and get some of these bubbles out. Tap it, bang the shit out of it on the table, twirl it around the side of the cup. You can try blowing on it like this. I don't even know if any of this works, but hey, whatever makes you feel better. This resin in particular is actually really good stuff. It's quite slow drying, so most of the bubbles that you can see here, they all just evaporate anyway. They all come out on their own. So be very careful when we pour this resin, especially when we get around that hand that's sticking out. We don't want that resin to cling to the hand and kind of climb up the hand. Here we go. It's all nice and dry now. This is what it should look like. First thing we're going to do is we're going to sand it. And this is going to achieve three things. The first thing is it's going to scratch up the surface of the ice and make it look a bit more frosty. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to help our glazes to cling to the surface. Otherwise, if we just apply wet glazes over a glassy surface, they're just going to form little puddles and it's not going to look very nice. The third thing that we're going to do with the sandpaper is we're making a nice smooth edge. So when we pour that resin, while it's still wet, use a toothpick or something or an old paintbrush and sort of pull some of it outwards so that the resin clings to and over the lip of this base. So we have something to sand down and make it nice and smooth like this. And we're scratching up the surface, making it nice and frosty, but we don't want to go too overboard. We don't want to sand too much of it over the Space Marine and make him disappear. We'll clip this little knob off the bottom of our Night Lord's foot. We don't need that. And we're going to map out where his feet are going to stand, and we'll mark it using a little bit of wire to poke a little scratch so we know where it goes. Now we're going to drill it out. Drill out where the pin's going to sit. Now that we know where both feet are going to stand, we're going to use a scalpel. And this is really fun. We're going to have a bit of fun here. We're going to create some cracks in the ice. And the idea is that he's such a heavy bugger that every step he takes is making like a cracking sound, like I don't know if that sounds like ice or not, but he's cracking that ice with every step he takes and every move he makes. And then it starts looking like this. But let's add a few more cracks. Time to make this look like actual ice. We're going to use Lothern blue and we're going to thin it right down with water. Make it really, really thin. Start glazing it on the surface of this ice. Start inwards and push it outwards towards the outer rim of the base. And we're just going to do it in a kind of a stabbing sort of motion, or creating sort of lines, shards of ice. We're going for that kind of geometric sort of pattern, I suppose. So we don't really want to be making swirly circular motions with the paintbrush. We want to just get that sharp, straight line look. Push some of it up around the hand that's sticking out of the ice. And you can kind of crisscross it, go this way and that way, as long as we're doing it in straight lines. I feel like that just works better for ice. Continue glazing it and getting it a little bit stronger towards the outside. I'm going to do exactly the same thing using white scar, but make it even thinner. And you guys are learning the secret. My secret of how to make this awesome ice base that's suddenly really popular on the internet. And the secret is this. It's so easy. Have a look at this. Look how many shits are given doing this base. Look at this. I'm just flicking it all over the place. 0 shits. That's how many. It's so easy. We're just glazing it with only 2 colors. What we've got to do here with the cracks is we want to force a little bit of this white scar into the cracks, and then we'll quickly wipe it off with our finger before it dries. And you can see that makes it look kind of realistic. Gives those cracks depth, like they're cracking all the way through the ice, when really they're just scratches on the surface. Keep smashing a bit of that white into the cracks until we're happy with the effect. I've used a bit more of a strong white mix there for that one. You can see it shines up a little bit more. Now we're going to use a bit of metho. This is the stuff I use to strip minis. Strip the paint off plastic. Going to dip our finger in and wipe a little bit of it off on our hand. And really quickly, going to rub it all over the surface of the ice. This is just blending it and blurring it a little bit. So all of those harsh lines and scribbles that we'd done earlier, we're blurring them together. So that it looks sort of like this. We'll quickly use Abaddon Black to paint the rim, and we're going to use Games Workshop's best brush for this, the large base brush. This brush is perfect for painting the rims because it gets it really smooth. Now the painting of the base is pretty much finished. Let's add a little skull though. Rakarth flesh, we'll base coat it in that, and we're going to paint this skull exactly the same way, or using the same colors that we have used for the other skulls on the Night Lord. We want this skull to look very cold. It's going to be sitting in snow. Drakenhof Nightshade. We'll just basically drown it in that, won't we? And let it dry before we do the next stage, which is to build up the highlights back up with Rakarth flesh, nice and thinly, glazing it upwards. So we're going to have this lying down, and one side. So this is going to be the top side, and the other side that you can see on the right there, that's going to be the underside. So we'll make that darker, and we'll make this side lighter. It's going to be, like I said, this skull is going to be lying down on its side, just like it is right there. So we've got to think about where those shadows are going to be. And I want you guys to be inventive with the colors that you choose to paint bones, because bones don't just have to be bone color. You can add a lot of story to the bones. Like this skull is going to look very cold. Like he's just been sitting out in the snow for years and years and years, and he's just absolutely cold to the core. We're going to use Incubi Darkness and enhance the shadows. Thin it right down and glaze it downwards to the side that's going to be facing the ground. You can see we can get really nice smooth blending happening. Now we're going to use Screaming Skull, going back the opposite way, pushing the highlights back up, and also adding a little bit of a bone color. Screaming Skull has a little bit of yellow in it. It's a very bony color, so that's going to go nicely. And the very final stage for this skull is to add a little bit of white scar. Remember that this has been out in the weather. It's been out in the snow for who knows how long. So it's going to be very frosty and very cold. You can see we're just putting some of this white scar on the underside of these cracks and the underside of the eye sockets. Popping out all of the little cool details on this skull. This skull's from that box of about 1 billion skulls that Games Workshop did. And some of them are really cool. It's like some of these ones with cracks in it. The twisted jaw. Bloody awesome. Let's use some super glue and glue him to the ice base. Make sure we position him so that the shadow side of the skull is pointing downwards. Now it's time to varnish both models, both the base and the Night Lord. You can use whatever matte varnish you like for this, whatever tickles your fancy, but I like the Vallejo matte varnish the best, and I like to run it through the airbrush because I find that you just get a much smoother finish with the airbrush than you do with a spray cam. So anyway, let's airbrush it. Pretty simple stuff here, just airbrushing, spraying the matte varnish over the model. Make sure we don't do too much at once. Sometimes it's a bit hard to see since it's kind of invisible, so you just check the pressure and the consistency by spraying a bit on your glove there. The finished product. We want it to look nice and matte like this. We don't want it to be shiny because when it's matte, it looks colder. If it was shiny, it would be all melting and it's not as cold. So we want that ice to have a matte finish. We'll just hit this eyeball with some Ard coat to make it look nice and glossy. Load it up, put a nice thick coat on. Do 2 if you want. Let's make some snow. We're going to use dishwashing detergent, PVA glue, and baking powder. We'll mix about equal parts PVA glue to dishwashing detergent. Mix it up, and then we'll push some baking powder into that mix. And we got instant snow. And we'll keep the left side of this mix. We'll have a little bit more glue in that section, and the right side of this pile will have a bit more baking powder. So we got different consistencies to play with. And now it's as simple as whacking it on, putting some snow on this base wherever you think it needs it. But we don't want to put too much of this snow on the base because we've got this really effective little scene here where the Space Marine's trapped under the ice, and we don't want to ruin it by overdoing it with things like too many skulls or too many bits of snow, or just a bunch of elements that it might be a little bit unnecessary. So we just want to be careful and add only a little bit of snow just to help tell the story that this is in some kind of freezing cold Arctic environment or some frozen planet that's just super cold, and there's some snow. And this is really fun doing this, just getting it on our brush, using an old brush. We don't want to use our good brushes for this sort of thing. Just putting clumps of snow on, and of course we want to put some on this hand that's been sticking out of the ice for who knows how long, a long time probably, and he'll be there for a little bit longer, I reckon. Unless someone comes and saves him. And have a look at how the consistency of this snow, it just looks so realistic. And you don't even have to do anything to it. Just the way it comes off the brush and attaches to the hand here like this, it looks real. Like it looks like it's frozen on there, and it's been wind blasted even. We can brush it across the fingers a certain way so it looks like it's wind blasted. Make sure we don't get any over the face of the Space Marine, because we want to look in there and see all that detail later on. Don't cover it up with snow. Definitely don't do that. Using a bit of the mix that has more glue in it there, so it just makes it a little bit of a different snowy effect. Maybe it's a little bit more icy there. When it dries, it'll look icy. Now let's make it snow. Use a toothpick and just flick some paint, some of the snow mix using your paintbrush. Don't go overboard with this. Just put a little bit on, just so it looks like it's snowing, really. And we're going to stipple a little bit on the bottom of his cloak. Always be very careful when adding these kind of effects like mud and grime or snow or anything like that to your models, because you can easily overdo it. But we definitely want to put a little bit on his feet and his cloak, just so that it puts him in that environment. It lets us know he's been walking around in the snow for quite a while. He didn't just appear magically out of a spaceship and just teleport there, which I guess he possibly could have done, but he didn't. He's been walking around in the snow looking for blood angels. Get a little bit too much, just wipe it off. Definitely want to put some clumps of snow under his feet here like this. And just stipple it. Get that sort of stippling action. And it comes off the brush really nicely, really realistically. And this is the main reason why I mix my own snow and I don't use the Games Workshop one, which by the way is fine. It's actually really awesome stuff. I just think that this is very, very slightly better, and the way it works on the brush is just a little bit different, and I really like how you can apply it to the base like this. Here we go. Here's the finished product. We got some good snow variation. We can clearly see that poor blood angel trapped under the ice. Here's what the bottom of the base looks like. Part 20. Let's finish this. All we've got to do is clip the Night Lord off his wire, just leaving a little pin, and we'll super glue him to the base. We've already drilled that hole for that pin. And one last thing which we forgot to do was just to flood some thinned down Abaddon black into these vents in the backpack. And believe it or not, he's finally finished. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll catch you right back here next time for a new exciting model. Hooroo and Happy New Year!